Free Code Camp is an online learning platform that takes people from knowing nothing about code to having enough knowledge to build software for a living. We've already done a show with Quincy Larson, the founder of Free Code Camp, in which we discussed his motivation for starting Free Code Camp. In today's episode, we talk more about the technical architecture of Free Code Camp. The economics of running a free interactive platform with thousands of users informs the architectural strategy. Free Code Camp does not even have ads, so it needs to be frugal. Berkeley Martinez is the CTO of Free Code Camp, and in today's episode, he discusses how Free Code Camp works from a technical perspective, including how the site's sandboxed coding environment is built. I really enjoyed having Berkeley over to discuss Free Code Camp, and I think you're going to enjoy this episode too. Continuous integration gives you faster, safer software delivery. With a continuous integration tool like snap.ci from Thoughtworks, the members of your team can push changes independently of each other, and they can all see their new builds running against different phases of tests before those changes make their way into production. The fastest moving companies that I've talked to on Software Engineering Daily are all using continuous integration. SnapCI from Thoughtworks is available to anyone. And if you go to snap.ci/softwareengineeringdaily, you can check it out for yourself and support Software Engineering Daily. With just a few clicks, I had my own continuous integration set up for some projects that were just sitting in my GitHub account without continuous integration. I got continuous integration up quite easily using SnapCI. If you want to be that hero at your company that starts moving your organization towards deploying often, more confidently, towards that DevOps dream, start working with SnapCI at snap.ci/softwareengineeringdaily. Your coworkers will see you working with SnapCI, and they will fall in love with it themselves. Oftentimes, it takes somebody at a bigger company to go out on their own and say, okay, I'm going to roll out CI even though nobody else at the company is using it. And maybe that hero at the company is going to be you. So check out snap.ci/softwareengineeringdaily. And thanks to Thoughtworks for being a continued sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. It really means a lot. Berkeley Martinez is the CTO of Free Code Camp. Berkeley, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you.
Free Code Camp is an online platform that teaches people to code for free. It's organized as a series of challenges that the Free Code Camp users make their way through. Explain the experience of a camper as they go through Free Code Camp.
Sure. We start them out with HTML, CSS, and then we quickly jump them to jQuery and then JavaScript, algorithms. These are mainly to get people familiar with syntax and get them familiar with looking at code. The main bread and butter is the projects. And the projects involve a certain number of user stories, and then the camper or our students can implement those user stories in any way they see fit.
The early challenges within Free Code Camp, when you start onboarding, those are mostly related to the meta tasks of being a programmer and also the meta tasks of Free Code Camp. You get onboarded into the community. It shows you the importance of the community, the content within Free Code Camp and the Medium channel. And what's the importance of getting the camper acquainted with the overall community before they even start coding?
Sure. Well, the most important part of coding or becoming a programmer is community. A lot of people can do it in isolation, but it takes them a lot longer. The aha moment comes when you find a community, find a group of people that you can code with and solve problems together. And you find that you become 10 times better at learning syntax or learning code, learning patterns than if you were trying to do it on your own and constantly having to look up things and not knowing what to look up.
There's also the meta challenges of learning to become a good Googler or Stack Overflow user, I feel like the early curriculum of Free Code Camp also teaches that as an important thing to be able to do. Like when you're solving a problem as a programmer on Free Code Camp or otherwise, you need to be good at Googling. There seems to be a challenge in getting people to recognize that the cycle of problem solving doesn't begin with having a problem and then asking somebody. It begins with having a problem and then asking Google. Like, how do you acquaint people with that process, with the proper cycle of solving a problem?
There are definitely two methods that a lot of new coders go about trying to solve a problem. And the first one isn't usually search Google, because a lot of times you don't know what to search. But what a lot of people do is they'll just hammer through it, trying different things, changing a line of code or a character until something works. Then the second part is definitely the faster way is doing the Google way, is where you search and hopefully know what term to search for, and finding the answer, not just the answer itself, but the explanation of why that answer fits. We like to promote the idea of first asking questions, though, and not just on Google, but asking the community itself. We have a very active Getter community, a very real-time way to get answers. And a lot of people there that are answering questions are fellow campers that have gone through the same problems. And then the second, the approach after that is to search Google in case the real people fail.
It sounds like I had the optimal process totally reversed because, well, when I was going through school, I felt like I got trained to ask Google the question and then ask a classmate or another person in the computer lab. It sounds like with Free Code Camp, you actually encourage people to ask each other questions before asking Google.
Yeah, it's definitely the community aspect makes it makes the learning process stronger. But then there are also things like, for instance, a ternary expression, right? How do you search for that? Like expression, question mark, expression. Like unless you know the term ternary expression, you don't know what to search for. If you see that in someone else's code, you're like, what is this? And then you try to Google it, Google's not going to be optimized for that kind of search. So the easiest solution is to go in a live chat, or if you're in class, you ask your buddy next to you, hey, do you know what this means? Like, what is this thing doing? Right? That's why we encourage people to ask the community first, or the Getter room or the forum we have before going to Google if it's something like that.
The early steps and challenges of Free Code Camp are related to these meta aspects of programming and the community and the learning process that the camper is going to go through. Eventually, you get into coding itself. At what point in the curriculum do you actually get into coding, and what are the first steps that a camper goes through in the coding process?
So after the onboarding, the first things we introduce them in are HTML. So not exactly coding, but getting used to HTML tags and looking at HTML, and then CSS, getting used to the CSS syntax. And then we introduce them to a little bit of JavaScript before we go into jQuery. And now this is something we face a lot of criticism for because we jump into jQuery before we really teach them JavaScript. And this is something that we're remedying now. So pretty soon, within the next month or two of recording, we should see a new version of the site with a much expanded curriculum. And this will change the order of things where you'll start out learning JavaScript first, and jQuery later on within the context of frameworks.
Why is it problematic to start with jQuery before JavaScript?
Because jQuery isn't JavaScript, really. And this has been the trend for a long time where people would learn jQuery and become jQuery developers, but not necessarily JavaScript developers. Now JavaScript has come into its own. A lot of browsers, or I should say the web spec has a lot of document querying syntax that's very similar to jQuery, so it makes a lot of the nice things that jQuery provided obsolete. Not completely obsolete. jQuery is still a little better at some things, but you can get away with doing just JavaScript and using methods that are universal to most modern browsers. So jQuery isn't the greatest way to go about teaching JavaScript in the first place, especially now since JavaScript is revolved around frameworks, right? Learning JavaScript means learning a framework like Angular or React, and then learning the concepts of those patterns that those frameworks provide, not necessarily just querying the DOM and then changing the DOM.
That's certainly true, though the jQuery querying the DOM model of learning can be simple. It can be perhaps simpler than working with a framework. And what is appealing about that to me is you get people excited about programming because things are simple and they're understandable at first. Is there a trade-off between getting people that quick win of experiencing mutating the DOM with jQuery and teaching them things in a sensible, ordered way that builds them the correct model of programming?
So the loss there you're saying is that you don't see the immediate feedback, right? Which is I think the thing that draws so many people to web development is the immediate feedback. Yeah. But you don't necessarily lose that by not doing jQuery first, because you can still do DOM querying and DOM changing without jQuery. That's the beauty of the modern web, and I mean modern in the context of the last 2 years, 3 years. We have document.getElement by class and these methods around the same idea of querying the DOM, and then you can still change the DOM just like you would outside of jQuery or with jQuery, but you can do it outside of jQuery just by learning JavaScript. Now you learn just how objects and methods work, and you learn about the document object and the window object, and then you can do all the fancy things that jQuery does without having to also teach jQuery.
So we've talked through an overview of how the camper gets started with learning Free Code Camp, and I did an episode with Quincy Larson last year about Free Code Camp, and we talked through a lot of this idea of the curriculum process. I'd like to get your perspective on the architecture of how Free Code Camp is built. Can you give me a high-level view for the architecture?
So the current architecture is a pretty typical Node app. So we have Loopback as our backend, which is built on Express. It builds our models using JSON, and then it provides us with a really nice REST API for our front-end app to use. For the most part, the app has been a plain Jade rendered on a server template, then becomes a very minimal jQuery app. The actual challenging parts are the running of the challenges in the browser. And we used to do this with web workers. Our current implementation is doing everything in isolated iframes. The very next iteration that's coming about is going to be entirely React, where all the challenges, all the UI is built with React, with Redux, and then using RxJS to handle all our side effects. We're still running the challenges within an iframe just to isolate those from the environment, but now the framework that puts together a user's code and puts them with a test and then runs the tests, it's a little more complex now because we want to be a little more generic. So now we can do things like Sass and React on top of what we already do, jQuery, just plain JavaScript, HTML, CSS. So our backend is Loopback, and then our database is MongoDB running in a replica set with 2 replicas and our arbiter.
You're talking about the sandbox that the coder can experiment with and write their tests. So in a given challenge, the coder, their task might be write an HTML blob that says hello world, or write a blob of JavaScript that does this. There are a lot of different websites that are doing this these days where you have like a sandboxed experience where you're learning to code in the browser. What are the challenges to developing that type of sandbox environment?
Yeah, it is a very difficult challenge.
And you ended up doing it in an iframe, so maybe you could explain why the iframe was a good fit for the abstraction of a sandbox to code in.
Sure. So originally we were doing them in web workers.
Right.
The issue with web workers is everything needs to go in as a string and then come out as a string. There's very limited ways to get functionality, like methods, into and out of web workers. On top of that, a web worker isn't a full DOM environment, so we ended up having to mock a lot of things, or do tricky things to make things like jQuery work, because you don't have the DOM environment. You have to prepare that. It ended up just giving us tons of headaches, and so I did a little testing with iframes where instead of building this long string and then running it in an eval in a web worker, now we build this long string and run it, compile it together in HTML, and then open an iframe and then use that HTML as the document for the iframe. And then the tests, instead of being concocted with that long string, are inputted into a method in that iframe. And then that method takes that string of tests and then evals them and then runs the test against in that environment, the iframe environment. So now it's closer to what you would expect an actual site, the way an actual site works. But now we get a lot of things for free, like the DOM is there, jQuery works out of the box, and we can shut down and boot up new iframes easily, and not have to worry about CSP issues, right? Things with web workers not supporting, or we had a lot of issues with web workers and CSP and blobs.
What is CSP?
Content security policy. So Chrome especially is very strict about these things, and web workers trigger different security aspects than iframes.
Interesting.
And there are cool things that we want to do with web workers that we couldn't figure out why Chrome would always say this is not valid.
Dice helps you easily manage your tech career by offering a wide range of job opportunities and tools to help you advance your career. Visit Dice and support Software Engineering Daily at dice.com/SE Daily and check out the new Dice Careers mobile app. This user-friendly app gives you access to new opportunities in new ways. Not only can you browse thousands of tech jobs, but you can now discover what your skills are worth with the Dice Careers Market Value Calculator. If you're wondering what's next, Dice's brand new career pathing tool helps you understand which roles you can transition to based on your job title, location, and skill set. Dice even identifies gaps in your experience and suggests the skills that you'll need to make a switch. Don't just look for a job. Manage your tech career with Dice. Visit the App Store and download the Dice Careers app on Android or iOS. To learn more and support Software Engineering Daily, go to dice.com/SE Daily. Thanks to Dice for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. We really appreciate it. Are there limitations to the browser approach? I've had a number of conversations with my friend Srini, who works at a company called DataQuest. DataQuest is learn data science in the browser, and my understanding of their backend is whenever you're doing a coding challenge in the browser, your code is actually getting run on a Docker container. So they spin up a Docker container for your sandbox. Did you consider something with more of a back-end approach rather than the heavy client sandboxed in the browser approach?
Yeah, we've considered it a couple times. The biggest issue with those approaches are costs. Right. And so Free Code Camp is in a very different situation than a lot of these websites are, where we're not VC funded. We don't plan on ever taking VC money or selling advertisement or anything like that. And that means that we need to keep our costs down as much as possible. And doing things like running a Docker container for every camper that's running their code. And, this happens multiple times per camper, per minute. The easiest solution there is to run everything in the browser. So then you offload the compute power from your dedicated servers to the the camper's browser. So that introduces its own set of problems, but the cost is the biggest problem for us. Sure. And so we definitely can't do anything like that. And that running stuff on the back end also introduces issues of security. If you're going to run someone else's code, you have to do it in something like a Docker container, right? Where you can just shut down that thing really easily and not have any doubts about security. But you can't really do it any other way. You have to run in some sandbox that can't affect the rest of your production.
Do you feel like there are security vulnerabilities in the free code camp model of sandboxing?
So we absolutely try not to do anything that would involve losing data or manipulating data outside of the context of a user updating the user data. And so the only vulnerabilities that we've found that we quickly patch up are things like CSP, not CSP, but CSRF. So we have very strong CSRF, which means we are limited in the kind of things that we can do in the browser. So, for instance, we're moving to use something called a product called GoMix, which is really interesting. You can create a Node server and write code for Node right in the browser without having to ever touch the command line, and it gives you a dedicated URL to a server. And so we want to use this as our API challenges. So someone could write an API using GoMix, give us the URL, and then we can write AJAX requests to those URLs to test whether their APIs are working correctly. So one of the security issues with that is now we need to allow challenges to make AJAX requests so that the tests can run against an origin that is not free code camp. So we whitelist GoMix, but then this introduces another issue. If someone were to create a challenge or run a challenge, save their code in this challenge in a malicious way. So for instance, whenever you complete a challenge, we save your code so that you can use it or you can check it out at some later point in time. We also give you a URL with that, your challenge code encoded in that URL. And so you can then share this challenge URL with anyone else. So now we allow AJAX requests to GoMix. Someone could potentially create a malicious GoMix URL, a server there, and then create a malicious solution to a challenge, and then share that with someone in the context of, hey, I need help. And then that malicious script could be loaded in the client's code or the client's browser, and then hit a specific GoMix URL and then do something malicious. So in order to combat that, now we disallow challenges to be saved with the GoMix URL. So now if you try to save a challenge with the GoMix URL, even in a comment, it'll be stripped out. So those are the kind of security issues we're dealing with.
Is that the hardest part of the Free Code Camp project, the challenge, sandbox, and security risks associated with that?
Not necessarily the security risks, but the building of challenges and making it in such a way that it's generic so that we can do jQuery, we can do React, we can even do Sass. These things all need to be done in the same framework. And so the next version, not the current version, but the next version is done in such a way that we have this idea of virtual files. And I took inspiration from Gulp, actually. So Gulp has this idea of virtual files. They're called vinyl files. And what we ended up with is very similar. It's not exactly the same. Doesn't need all the same aspects that Gulp does because Gulp interacts with the file system and we don't. So we don't need to keep track of file paths. But we keep track of file names and file extensions. And so each time you edit code in your editor while you're in Free Code Camp, you're actually editing sort of this virtual file where it has a file name, it has an extension, and it has contents. And then we update the contents, and then we keep a history of that. And then when you finally hit submit, we take that file or multiple files in future versions and then compile them together in a similar way that Webpack would. Compile them into one single file. So if you're doing HTML, we compile them into just a plain string and then put it in a body tag and then add a header and a footer, and then send that to an iframe. if you're doing JavaScript, we compile your code together and then put that in a script tag and then put that in a body tag and put that in an iframe. Same thing with Sass.
I want to talk a little bit more about the curriculum. The current curriculum model has 4 stages. You can start with front-end certification and then get back-end certification, and then data visualization, and then full stack engineering certification. The most interesting aspect of that sequence I find is the data visualization element. So when I was learning programming, I never focused on data visualization at any point. Why is data visualization a crucial step to learn for somebody who is on track to becoming a full stack engineer?
Sure. So the first thing I want to point out is even though we list them out in a linear fashion, you don't necessarily need to do them in a linear fashion. You can do them with whatever order you feel like, whatever order you feel comfortable with. And people will do this, right? Some people will just do the front end and the back end, or front end and then the frameworks. The reason we put data viz after the front end is the data viz is really UI heavy. It's building interesting UIs using large data sets. And we think that's important to people to kind of understand what that process is, not necessarily be an expert at it. We think the most important part of Free Code Camp is developing the projects, not necessarily the projects for certain curriculum or certain parts of that. So if you don't feel comfortable doing the data science or data viz part of it, then I say go for backend or frameworks. We just want to say that even though we think all these things are important, do what you feel most comfortable with, that you can progress as quickly as possible through, get to the projects, because the projects are going to be where you're going to learn the most.
When you joined Free Code Camp, how did the architecture look and how has it changed since then?
So when I joined, it was pretty similar to what it is now in production. It was an Express app, not loopback, and we were using Mongoose at the time. So we still had a MongoDB database. And the front end was mostly Jade and jQuery, but with a few elements of Angular, mostly for the forms. The biggest reason I came on is there were so many issues with the codebase. And while these issues didn't take the site down, right, so the site was still working, there were constant things like there's a common error with Express that if you send down a response for a client and then there's an error in some process that you left running, you'll get this error, cannot send after headers have been sent, or something like that. When I came on, this was the first thing I noticed, is we had tons of those. And that was because there were a lot of endpoints that were sending the user data while sending, for instance, an email out using NodeMailer. And you still have a callback with NodeMailer. NodeMailer is going to give you an error if it can't send out for whatever reason. But these weren't being handled. They were just being left open-ended. And so when these things do error, they just throw into the wild, and what ends up happening is that process itself gets shuts down and then reboots. And so while the site was still working and still functioning just fine, you have you don't have the performance you would because you have servers constantly having to reboot. The other thing we wanted is an API, because we wanted to be able to let users hit that API if they wanted to. And we want to do that in such a way that it's not a big maintaining hassle for us. So one of the interesting challenges we have is we're such a small team. We try to keep costs down. We can't really hire anyone. But we are open source, and we use the open source repo as a way for people to learn to contribute to open source and further their knowledge of becoming a programmer. And so we want to make the codebase itself easily understandable and easily maintainable so that anyone can come in and contribute to the codebase. So Loopback really helped us achieve that, because we could still create a complex REST API and just rely on a couple of JSON files to do that for us.
You're talking about the open source project. FreeCodeCamp is a massively popular open source project. I think there's like 529 contributors. What are some of the challenges of managing a large open source project?
Definitely early on, we weren't sure we were going to be able to do it because it was essentially me and Quincy managing the repo. And so reading all the issues, closing issues that weren't real issues, directing people to the appropriate solutions for their problems, and then fixing actual bugs. And so finding all these bugs and fixing these things. And I don't remember the exact date, but it was becoming really unmanageable. And so we obviously needed a solution. My idea was just the purpose of the repo itself. It shouldn't be just somewhere to put our code, but it should be a learning experience. And so we came up with the idea of just letting campers contribute and letting campers manage the code base and manage the repo and manage the issues, manage PRs. And so that's when we first started adding campers that we have seen active in the community. And this is the point where we realized that we could do it as long as we empower the community to help us. And by empowering people, we made the job of maintaining an open source project easier. And this is true of any open source project. If you follow the benevolent dictator model, where you just have one person in charge of a repo and they're in charge of merging PRs, what ends up happening is that person gets burnt out. And then the project either dies or stagnates. If it's an important project, it'll like limp along.
Right.
There's this idea of the open source model. And that's the idea of if you contribute a significant PR, a PR that makes significant changes, adding a significant feature, not just like a typo or something like that, then you should automatically be added to the repo with write privileges. Wow. So that it gives the person contributing to the repo a sense of ownership. And then hopefully they continue on contributing and also helping manage issues and testing things so that the project can live on as long as possible, as long as it's being used and useful.
You're saying if you contribute significantly, that is a proof of stake. And so you should be given privileges to merge other people's pull requests, which gets you away from the bottleneck of the benevolent dictator approach.
Especially if there's a lot of projects that just have so many people depending on them, and the benevolent dictator model just doesn't work in the long term. Everyone gets burned out. Everyone has, life get in the way. But if you spread out the responsibility of maintaining an open source project to the community itself, then the project itself lives on past the original creator or the original maintainer. And I hope to see this model adopted by other projects that are that we rely on in the community. Just to clarify, I didn't come up with this. I just realized it might sound like I did, but I didn't come up with this. I can't remember exactly who came up with it. I think it's like opensource.org, I believe. Yeah.
Do you also focus on making it easy to onboard in the open source community if you want to, like having issues that are super simple, always have a set of issues that are super simple to resolve? So if somebody wants to get started as a contributor to FreeCodeCamp, all they do is open up the beginner issues, bug fix tab, and they figure out what to solve from there?
Sure. We have the help wanted tag, and we have the beginners only tag. So these are issues that have been deemed simple enough for anyone to contribute to, specifically the beginners only. And we realized that a lot of people coming to the FreeCodeCamp repo, this might be their first time interacting with this idea of open source and this idea of contributing to other people's projects. And we want to make that process, that learning experience, as easy as possible and as friendly as possible. So not only do we have the help wanted and the beginners only tag, but we also have a lot of helpful documentation on how to contribute to an open source project. And we do this because I don't know if you remember your first PR to an open source project, but it is kind of nerve-wracking.
I've actually never made one.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, maybe Free Code Camp should be your first one. But anyways, it is kind of nerve-wracking because you're just learning. You're just starting out.
Yeah.
You're just learning kind of the unspoken rules. Sure. And you want to help out because you're using this thing. You're getting all this awesome software, all this awesome utility for free. And you want to contribute. So if you open a PR and you find a bug, you open a PR to a project you're using. Then you wait, and then the waiting process itself is kind of nerve-wracking because you don't know if the person maintaining the project is going to be like, no, this is dumb, I don't want this, close PR, or you never know, someone might respond badly. Like I think the one example is the Linux distro. The person maintaining that is notorious for being, I guess, grumpy, to put it in a nice way.
Yeah.
But anyways, we try to help them in every step of the way so that they find contributing and finding their first PR simple and easy and welcoming, so that hopefully they continue on not just at contributing to Free Code Camp's repos, but any other open source project.
When you joined Free Code Camp, had the project already migrated to using React as the front end, or were you part of the refactoring process to React?
Yeah, so it was still Angular, still jQuery on the front end. Okay. There were talks about it. This is before...
Oh, you're still Angular right now?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Now we actually have bits of it in React.
Okay.
Bits that are React in production, yeah. But the main bread and butter is the challenges framework. So that still isn't React. It's little bits of jQuery and mostly JavaScript, just plain JavaScript doing the heavy framework building. When I joined, though, we talked about doing this and ways to do it. And I think the main selling point was moving to Loopback so that we have this API, and then we can move to maybe a client-side only app that does all this heavy stuff on the client, and then we just maintain an API server. And then as React became more popular, and our frustration with teaching and using Angular grew, we decided just to completely abandon Angular. And at the time we were using, I think, Angular 1.2, and we decided just to abandon it completely and use React wherever possible. So now we use server-side rendering React. We use Redux, and we use Redux observables for our front-end stuff and our server-side rendering stuff. And we still use Jade for some of the more static pages. And so we're doing something pretty interesting now where we're moving to completely static pages for everything besides the challenges. And so we use Nginx to proxy some of the pages. So we've moved our shop. So we have a shop where we sell merchandise to help us cover the cost of servers. This used to be part of the actual repo. And it used to be rendered by our node servers and sent down as plain HTML. But this meant that our shop was tied to our release cycle for production. And because we have this giant move planned, that meant we had to update production just to update the shop, which seemed a weird thing to do to couple these things. So we moved the shop to a static page where it's just a static HTML page onto GitHub Pages, and then we proxy that using Nginx.
When I'm choosing the tools for my side projects, the first thing that I look for is ease of use. That's why I love MongoDB. It is the most popular non-relational database, and it is super easy to use. At the beginning of a project, I often don't know the shape of my objects, and Mongo makes it easy to evolve the database schema as I like over time. Over time, as my project gets popular, I'm going to need to scale, and thankfully, MongoDB has built-in horizontal scalability, but configuration and database maintenance aren't really what I want to spend my time on. Thankfully, Mongodb Atlas was released in 2016. Mongodb Atlas is the easiest way to get access to MongoDB without having to run the database yourself. You pay only for what you use, from small projects all the way up to large production deployments. To try MongoDB Atlas today, go to mongodb.com/SE Daily and get a free $25 in credit. Use promo code GOATLAS25 to get that $25 in free credit. Atlas is the only hosted MongoDB service built by the engineers behind the database, the company MongoDB. With Atlas, you get end-to-end encryption, you get VPC peering, you get access to the latest releases, and for a limited time, you can go to mongodb.com/SE Daily, enter promo code GOATLAS25, and get that $25 in credit and get started with MongoDB Atlas. Thanks to MongoDB for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily, and thanks for being the database behind a lot of my favorite side projects in the past. We're really happy to have MongoDB as a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. What did React get right? Why did so many of the JavaScript frameworks that came before it fail to get the abstractions right and the whatever React does that makes it so useful from your point of view? I mean, I've been doing shows on React for the last year and a half or so, and hear varying responses from people, things like its relationship to functional programming or event-driven architecture. What is useful about React from your point of view?
So I'm coming from the learner's point of view, not necessarily the
somebody who has learned or somebody who you want to teach?
Someone who is teaching and someone who's learned. Okay. Because when I first started learning React, I didn't really consider myself a developer, maybe. Right? I was developing, I was making money as a freelancer, but I guess it's an imposter syndrome. I still felt like an imposter. But when I started learning React, I felt like I was actually learning code, learning JavaScript. And so one of the frustrations we had with Angular is just teaching Angular was difficult because we were teaching concepts that were unique to Angular. So, directives and transclude and all these Angular terms. They're more complicated than they need to be. Whereas when React came onto the scene, I think what made the big difference is learning it is not about learning React, right? Other than JSX. But even that is just learning sort of an abstract DOM syntax. But the other stuff around it is still JavaScript. You're learning to build classes. You're learning to build functions. And that's it, right? You're just calling methods on classes, on instances. You're not building directives and bundling templates, and it's specifically JavaScript. And that for me is the big selling point, because you're not teaching tons of other things on top of that.
Is there anything that campers, new programmers, have trouble understanding in React? Many themes of difficulties?
I think JSX itself is maybe the most difficult thing, and that's because if you learn the DOM and you're just starting out, then you learn this JSX thing that looks really close to the DOM, but it's kind of like the uncanny valley, whereas if it's close enough, if it's not exactly the same, then you get confused, right? Where it's far enough, then if it's different enough, then it's easy to learn. And when it gets closer, it's just, oh, this doesn't work. Why doesn't this work? It works in the DOM. So for instance, HTML class, right? So the class attribute in JSX is class name, one word with a capital N. So the HTML attribute for, as in a label for some ID, right? In JSX, it's actually HTML4, so HTML capital F or little things like that can trip people up. The biggest thing with React that was really difficult for people is just not React itself, but the ecosystem around it. So bundling, so Webpack, state management like Redux, those things can bring a lot of confusion. But we have this awesome thing now called Create React App, which gives you a really nice starting point to start building React apps without necessarily thinking about the pipeline around it, the production around it, or the bundling around it, just to get right into building React apps.
I want to zoom out a bit and talk about FreeCodeCamp as an organization and its mission. I talk to Quincy sometimes about Quincy Larson, by the way, the founder of FreeCodeCamp. We have conversations about the long-term goals of FreeCodeCamp and particularly competitors. So there's like lots of competitors in the learn to code space, whether you're talking about Udacity or Coursera or maybe coding boot camps. There are a wide variety of ways that somebody who wants to learn to code can learn to code. Do you think of these other organizations as competitors, or do you think of this as just a big communal effort to get people to learn to code? How do you think about the other organizations?
Well, generally, I don't think about them. We compare the amount of traffic going to these other to what people would call competitors, but the issue is, for the most part, they have some system to charge users, and I think once you start charging for these services, then your customer base sort of starts changing, because it becomes obvious that not everyone has the ability to pay, right? Not everyone has the benefit of being in a big city where they have tons of services that are provided for them. Some people are in rural areas. They don't make much money, or they can't just spare that kind of things, or the time it takes for these competitors, or the time it takes to work on sites on these competitors and then spend the money on top of that. The one thing that we do think about a lot is the long term of FreeCodeCamp, and the goal is to work the company around FreeCodeCamp in such a way that we can sustain FreeCodeCamp itself indefinitely, without ever charging anyone, any of our campers, anyone that's using the process to learn, or any of the nonprofits that benefit from our campers' work. So in that aspect, places like, well, I guess I don't want to name any other companies, but we don't think of them too much on that aspect, right? And then a lot of companies that do charge, they're realizing that charging the learners isn't really the best way to make money. And what ends up happening is they try to find other ways around it. So I think one way that one of these companies is doing it is through charging corporations, right? For sure. So I think they got bought out by a bigger company that.
So charging corporations for
material and just going through going through that process, the corporate training process. Sure. So one interesting thing that Quincy told me once is once you divorce the people paying for services from the people consuming those services, then the price of those services ends up skyrocketing. And I think that's why a lot of these companies end up going towards the corporate route. Because what ends up happening is the corporates pay for these services, and then the people consuming it are their employees. They're not paying for it. They don't know the dollar amount, and then it's hard to judge the value for these things.
FreeCodeCamp is a purist organization in this model of not raising money, not doing ads or Patreon or anything at this point. Maybe that will change in the future. What do you think about, doing something for short-term profit as a means to an end? Is it really not worth it to do that? I mean, maybe if you could raise some debt or raise some money or do some kind of Kickstarter campaign in service of growing faster, I don't know, or maybe the money just would not make it grow faster at all. Why the purist approach?
So the growing faster is interesting because we actually are growing pretty fast. Even for a company that has zero investment, right. We're growing day in, day out. So the growing is not too big of an issue. But so for instance, raising money through VC, once you raise money through VC, then the incentive changes, right? So right now, our stakeholders are the campers themselves. But once we take VC money, for instance, now the stakeholder is someone that's given us money and is expecting a 10 times or 100 times return on that investment. So then that might change the way we perceive the campers. We might see them as a means to an end to get more money. And that's definitely something we don't want. We don't ever want that to happen, right? So that's why you always guarantee.
You're very cognizant of your own incentives as created by the financial structure of your company.
Right. So anytime you take money from someone else, even if it's through like a Kickstarter campaign, that changes the incentive. Then we become a company that is focused on raising money through Kickstarter. So we make a Kickstarter and then down the line, we need more money. Now we're going to make another Kickstarter. And then we focus around promoting that Kickstarter and driving people to our Kickstarter. And that's not driving people to learning to code. So we aware of these things, and we definitely, it'd be nice to make money, but we definitely want to do it in some way that doesn't affect the campers. So Free Code Camp is always there for anyone that wants to learn.
What I love about Free Code Camp is that fact that it is always there to learn, and if you want to make a career change to being a programmer, you can do that. One thing that's interesting right now we have in the economy is all of these jobs that are getting automated. Some people might say outsourced, but I tend to think of automation as the more truthful word. And the techno-utopian in me says, okay, if people get automated out of a job, they can retrain as a programmer. It's not that hard. Go on Free Code Camp, learn to be a programmer. There is some narrative, maybe it's just in America, maybe this is a global thing. People don't want to retrain. There are a lot of people who will not retrain. Even if the technology is there, they have a pessimistic outlook. They have a lack of faith in themselves to be able to retrain. I think we have all these highly damaging narratives around neuroplasticity disappearing by the time you're 23 or 24 and you can no longer retrain, and you have to double down on the small set of skills you've learned before your early 20s, which there's no proof that that's actually the way that the human brain works, no convincing proof. As somebody who is heavily involved in a project that helps people to retrain and to learn a new skill set that gets them a new lease on life, and you can look at Free Code Camp and find all kinds of testimonials from people who have retrained and found new jobs as programmers. How do you think about this differential between people who believe that they can retrain and want to retrain, and then this vast amount of people who have lost hope or are unwilling to retrain? Because you even look at just I don't want to bring politics into this, but like the Trumpism, like whether you're for or against Donald Trump, a lot of people who voted for Trump are these people who have lost hope and they don't feel like they can retrain at all. So as somebody who's like heavily engaged with this group of people who are retraining or are not, or are in the process of going from a place where they feel like they are not useful to a place where they might potentially be more useful if they can retrain, I don't know, is this a mindset shift that people need to make? Or, I don't know, do you think that my framing of it is accurate?
Well, it could be that a lot of people who don't have that mindset of retraining, that desperation will trigger that change in mindset. And I found that for me, that's happened a couple times in my life where
Really?
I was in a desperate situation and, I didn't think about maybe I can't be a programmer. I just thought about maybe this is a way to make money and, not be broke. So, maybe that will trigger that kind of thing. But there is definitely an interesting, idea there, like that maybe, people who voted for Trump, are looking for that help so they don't have to retrain. I don't know if there is really any hope for people who are in those jobs that are going to be automated. And I think truck drivers is like the biggest thing people talk about right now, is because it's such a large population in the US, truck drivers, that potentially in the next 5-10 years could be out of a job. I am certain that we have former truck drivers in our alumni, right, that are now developers.
Yeah.
I truly think anyone could learn anything new at any point in life.
Yeah.
I don't think that there's the myth of once you pass a certain age, your brain is set in a certain way. I don't think that's true. There's been tons of evidence to the contrary of people who have, there's the story of a person who had a professor who had a stroke in his 60s, I believe, lost essentially half of his brain, and then became essentially couldn't take care of themselves. They were an infant essentially at that point, right? An adult mind trapped in an infant's body because they couldn't control their body, and then they retrained themselves, right, to use their body again by starting out as an infant, using infant toys, and eventually learning to become a fully functioning adult again.
Yeah.
So I think stories like that prove that you can teach yourself and turn into something else if you're in that kind of desperate situation. But I think maybe that you need that desperate situation to trigger that change. There needs to be some catalyst to trigger that change. And I think maybe that's the common factor of campers. There's outside of the people who have the free time to learn something new, who just want to learn something new. Maybe the people who have full-time jobs and a family that they're taking care of. Maybe the desperation is they're living check to check, and they want to make that change because they want to get out of this situation and into something more prosperous. Maybe that triggers their need to learn this trade, right?
Yeah.
That'll help them provide for the future.
Another thing I've talked to Quincy some about, and this is not closely related to Free Code Camp, but Quincy writes about this and talks about this, is this idea of Facebook potentially destroying the internet. And it's an interesting framing of what Facebook is and where it's going. The idea that it's this closed version of the internet, and that the efforts such as internet.org threaten the free and open internet. I've talked to Quincy about this. I argue that this framing is based on an over-idealization of the open internet, because the open internet's what we have been normalized to. We sort of have this nostalgia towards what we refer to as the open internet. So I find it qualitatively dubious to say that the open internet as we know it is better than the quote closed internet as Mark Zuckerberg may be trying to move us towards. What are your thoughts on this area? Have you debated with Quincy about this, or do you agree with him?
I agree with him that Mark Zuckerberg is probably one of the most powerful people in the world right now. He controls probably the biggest platform where people consume media.
Yeah.
I don't know how much control he really has over what people see, right? Because it's not like there's someone at a switchboard moving cables back and forth as someone visits Facebook.com, right? There's algorithms and all these servers that are running that show, and then we have a developer team that's upgrading it and fixing bugs and adding features. So it's not like he has his finger on the button, with all the fake news and controlling that stream. But he is probably, Facebook is probably one of the most powerful companies right now, and he's the head of Facebook and has the controlling shares of Facebook. I think that may change in the future. Who knows? There's a recent story. I don't know exactly all the details, but it was something like he wanted to sell a certain amount of his, Mark Zuckerberg wanted to sell a certain amount of his shares so that he could transfer that money to his foundation. That's and then, but then he wanted to change the way the shares work so that he still has a controlling majority.
That's right.
And then there's some legal issue he's running into now, where that people are angry about that. And now there's a lawsuit, I think, or, like the government itself is like, you can't do that because of, I can't remember, I don't know the exact details, but this is one of the reasons why I don't know how big of a deal is it that he controls Facebook, is because while he is a very powerful person, there are a lot of other powerful people that are invested in Facebook. And if he makes a move that's contrary to what they want, they could organize the rest of the people that are invested in Facebook and counteract him. It's an interesting idea that he could manipulate people on a large scale. I don't know how practical it is. It is kind of scary that he has so much power, and it is scary when any single individual has so much power and there's no real way to remove him from power. For instance, if he was president of the United States, in 4 years, there would be an election, and there's a possibility that he could be deposed. But if you're the ruling person in a company, then you're that forever until you make a mistake.
Sure.
Right. So, hopefully it's nothing bad comes of him being the leader of Facebook.
To wrap up, you and I were talking before this podcast interview about isolation, working in isolation. This has been an increasing topic of importance for me. I think it is important to a lot of the listeners. I think there are a lot of programmers who listen to this show that are sole proprietors or consultants or contractors, and they spend a lot of time working in solitude. And I think this is actually growing in importance as an issue, even beyond the idea of just being a programmer working in solitude. I've been hearing more and more about the dangers of loneliness and isolation, and maybe that's just because I'm reading about it and I spend a lot of time isolated, and I don't like it, but I also like running my own podcast business. I know you like running Free Code Camp as CTO, but you don't have an office. I mean, you have a home office. You spend a lot of time in isolation. You were talking about the importance of meetups. How do you deal with that isolation and seeing as this, this trend of remote work and working in solitude is growing? How do you suggest people deal with that isolation on a larger scale?
Yeah, I think the one of the biggest reasons I go to meetups is just to interact with other fellow human beings, right? So, and I was saying this to you earlier, is I think this is the reason why the meetup is so big here in San Francisco, is that one, you have a situation where a lot of people are either working in solitary, working at home, for instance, or working in situations where they may be surrounded by people, but their work is individualistic, or they're coding for hours on end without stopping. And then two, you have the companies that just want people to come to their offices so that they can recruit. So I think, that's probably a major factor of why Meetup is so big. And that's a major factor of why I go to so many meetups, is just you meet interesting people. I spend a lot of time alone and then going to these meetups. It's just a way to interact with other people. And I've met so many people doing that. Like, that's how I met Quincy is I would go to so many meetups, and this was like maybe 3 years ago. And like, I would see him everywhere. And like, he's a pretty interesting guy. And he's hard to miss. He always wears like a jogging equipment, I don't know what you'd call it, like just track pants, like wicking shirts, and he runs everywhere. And so every time I would see him, if he just arrived, he would be just dripping in sweat because he just runs everywhere. And then like, I remember one time I asked him, like, do you want like a paper towel or something? Cause and he was like, no, because the sweat is the most efficient way to, reduce your core temperature. If I would just wipe off the sweat, I would just sweat more. And I was like, oh, it was very like telling of his character. Is like, he works to be, as efficient as possible, and not in a negative way, in a very positive way. And I think that's why he can do as much as he does, right? And so I think I got a little off track there, but we were talking about isolation.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Well, I talked to Quincy about this topic too, and he was like, I hope he doesn't mind me quoting this, but he said something like, sometimes I don't even feel like a human. I just feel like a disembodied thing that is online all the time. And occasionally I have interactions in the real world that reinforce my interpretation that I am a human and that I am not a disembodied online entity. And I was like, I get that feeling sometimes too.
He's a if I had never met him, I would assume he was a robot or some sort of advanced AI, because I don't know how he does it. He's just constantly working, and then he has a family, he raises a family. He's like, every time I'm in a Skype meeting with him, his baby's there. So he's always with his baby Jocelyn, which I think she's maybe like a year and a half. Don't quote me on that. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, he's a very efficient person, and he's a very, like, he may say that, but he's a very human person as well. He's probably one of the most human people I've ever met. Yeah, he's just a very interesting person.
All right. Well, Berkeley, thanks for coming on Software Engineering Daily. The time flew by talking to you. And I guess just to plug it, since we didn't talk about it, you are part of Real World React, which is a meetup and soon to be more prevalent online organization around React. So if you are a React developer, maybe you want to check out Real World React.
realworldreact.com.
Okay.
And then we're on Meetup, meetup.com/real-world-react. And then if I can, we also have a hackathon coming up. We're calling it Reactathon. So reactathon.com. It's going to be leading up to the React Conf in March. I think it's been officially announced, so I can say it now. It's going to be, the React Conf is, I think, the 13th and 14th. And so that's a Monday, Tuesday. The Saturday, Sunday, we're having a hackathon. And then the week leading up to it, we're going to have a meetup at, I'm not going to say where, because I can't remember exactly which company is doing what, but we're going to have a huge meetup on the Tuesday before the conference, and then workshops the whole week leading up to it, and a job fair.
Cool. Well, Berkeley, thanks for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thank you for inviting me.
Ad for Prize is an iOS app where users can create ads to win prizes. Companies post these prizes as an incentive for people to make ads. If you're a creative person and you love to compete, you will love Ad for Prize. Check it out on the iOS App Store. Only the most creative advertisements win the prizes, like $150 cash or $100 gift certificates to your favorite retail companies. With Ad for Prize, I am trying to change the way that online advertising works, and I'm currently hiring an iOS developer to lead the engineering of Ad for Prize. If you'd like to work with me, send me an email, jeff@softwareengineeringdaily.com. And if you have an iOS device, check out Ad for Prize, ADFORPRIZE, Ad for Prize, one word. Check it out on the iOS App Store, and I hope you continue to listen to Software Engineering Daily.